During my first assignment, there was a parishioner who brought a friend of hers who was interested in becoming Catholic. And after learning a little bit about what it means to be a Catholic before she entered the RCIA, she decided against it. And her friend, a very devout Catholic, shared with me that her decision was that she would look for a church that would accept her for who she is, because she had to be true to herself. To this parishioner, I said, well, I hope eventually you as a friend will share with her that she will be hard-pressed to find any authentic Christian faith that will accept her for who she is and tell her she has to be true to herself. No authentic Christian faith would ever do that or say that. It's a very popular cliché that we find in Shakespeare, in Hamlet, Act 1, Scene 3. Very popular line, "To thine own self be true." But nowhere in the Scriptures do we hear that line. What we do hear is, you must deny yourself. Not be true to yourself, but deny yourself. Take up your cross and follow after me. Now, this isn't to say that we don't make use of the talents that God gave us. It's not to say that we don't recognize how God made us and the gifts that He gave us so that we can produce fruit. We have parables that encourage us to do just that. But it's a very popular cliché that people have that often is used as an excuse to keep within a lifestyle or a value system that they don't want to let go. And they will say, I have to be true to who I am. To such a notion, Jesus might say, as He says to Peter in today's gospel, you are thinking not as God does, but as human beings do. Perhaps would go so far as to say the other thing Jesus told Peter, get behind me, Satan. Because such a notion would be contrary to what Jesus calls us to do. And to many who have often said that to me, I must be true to how God made me because God made me this way. My response is simple. God made you that way, but God did not make you for sin. And it is in that vein that we remember Jesus' words. Whoever wishes to come after me must not be true to yourself, but must deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. We see exercises throughout the year and in our own Christian practices in which we grow more in that notion of denying ourselves. Lent is a time in which we deny ourselves in the practices of fasting and abstinence and sacrifice. It's not something we want to do, and in fact during Lent it's a time where you hear people give reasons why they don't do it or don't have to do it. I often get into those reasons in the first few days of Lent because the beginning of Lent is the time of greatest temptation to move away from the things Jesus is asking us to do. But we engage in practices that in fact are contrary to our human nature. What are parts of our human nature? Well, we are people who need sustenance, food, and water. And yet, at times we are called to practice fasting, which is denying ourselves for a time, to not be ruled by our hunger, but to be masters of it. We have an instinct to procreation, human sexuality. That often is the subject under which people today will say, I must be true to myself. This is how God made me. And yet, both in the Jewish faith and the Christian faith, we have traditional practices and teachings that call us not to be true to who we are, but to deny ourselves in practicing the virtues of chastity and fidelity between a husband and a wife. And we have a basic instinct for self-preservation and survival. And we remember the words of Jesus when he says, "There is no greater love than to lay down your life for your friends." Not a teaching of self-preservation, but one of sacrifice for one another. And we see examples of that constantly. Peter was called to self-denial when Jesus told him, "Get behind me, Satan," because Peter's immediate thought was that the Messiah should not be crucified and handed over. And Jesus rebuked him, saying, "You are not thinking as God does, but as human beings do." St. Joseph, in this year of St. Joseph, we remember, denied himself in a very well-known story, and when he heard that Mary was with child, was going to simply but quietly dismiss her, call off the wedding, cancel the betrothal. But when he had revealed to him through the angel God's will in this, Joseph certainly denied himself, and perhaps in so doing sacrificed his community status as a righteous man, because who knows what they must have thought of him when he claimed Mary as his wife and her child as his, knowing that it was not, and a child conceived before they were married. We see numerous examples of saints denying themselves, and we hold them up as examples of holiness. And of course, on this weekend in which we remember the 20th anniversary of 9/11, if there's one group in particular that we are always remembering and honoring, is the heroic sacrifice of the first responders, who denied themselves and the basic human instinct of self-preservation and survival. As people were running downstairs, they were running up the stairs. As people were fleeing out of buildings, they were running into buildings. And by the hundreds on that day sacrificed their lives in their efforts to rescue people. Perhaps they, in fact, took Jesus' words to the next level. As Jesus said, "There's no greater love than to lay down your life for your friends," these men and women laid down their lives for total strangers. And we see examples of how they denied themselves. Who would have denied anyone running away from those buildings, as we saw pictures and images of crowds running away, but these men were running in. These men and women were going up the stairs, and in so doing sacrificed their lives. We are not called to be true to ourselves. That would constitute thinking not as God does, but as human beings do. And to a certain extreme, perhaps we would need to be told, "Get behind me, Satan," for we are not thinking as human beings do, but as God does. But rather, let us remember that we are not people who follow the gospel of Shakespeare. He has many very eloquent lines, but nowhere in our scriptures or in our teachings do we hear the line, "To thine own self be true." Let us be true to the gifts that God gave us, to build up the talents that Jesus calls us to build up, as he tells us in other parables. But in all things, let us remember the basic teaching that Jesus gives us. Not to be true to ourselves, but that we must deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow in his footsteps. Then, and only then, can we be considered his disciples.